What's up, everybody? Today I am here to talk about Haunted Houses by Robert San Souci. I'm not sure how to pronounce his last name. And this is a middle grade horror book, short story collection. And I have a couple of other books by this author. He is perhaps most well known for these ones. It is a series of short story books called Short and Shivery. I have this one here, A Terrifying Taste of Short and Shivery. And then this one is called Even More Short and Shivery. And I believe there is 4 books total in this series, so I'm missing 2 of them. And I've enjoyed these quite a bit. These are basically like Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark by Alvin Schwartz, to where you have the author taking old like folk tales and folk stories and legends and kind of rewriting them for a modern audience, and also for like the younger audience, for kids. And yeah, I've enjoyed these books quite a bit. And I just decided to pick this one up kind of on impulse. I've been in a little bit of a reading slump lately, and when I find that to be the case, I seem to enjoy reading short stories more because they don't require quite as much attention and focus. You can just read a short story more quickly and not have to spend as much time or get as invested in it. And so I've kind of just been casually reading through this book over the last few days, and I enjoyed it a lot more than I thought I would, so I decided to do a full review for this book. So, this book has 10 stories in it, I believe, and this is a pretty lengthy book. It's like almost 300 pages. It's like 270 pages, I think. Let's see, 276 pages to be exact. So, the stories in here average about like 25 pages in length each, with the longest one, I believe, being like 40 pages, and then a couple of them being only like 20 pages long. So the short stories in here are quite a bit longer than like what you would find in the Short and Shivery books, where with these ones you have like 30 to 40 stories, and each of them only being, 5, maybe 10 pages at the very most in length. So this book is a little bit more lengthy. The stories are a little bit more fleshed out, and I really enjoyed this. This book was super refreshing to me. And yeah, I'll kind of give a brief overview and give my thoughts for each of the stories in here. So, and this book also does have illustrations, which is really cool. This is the illustration on the first page here. You have a bunch of houses with like the shadows like outlining the haunted house. Then there's some illustrations kind of like spaced throughout. I think there's one for each story, as a matter of fact. And those were a nice little touch as well. I kind of enjoyed seeing all of those for each of the stories. So yeah, let's kind of go through all of the stories briefly, and I'll give you my thoughts on each one. I enjoyed most of the stories in here. I won't go into great detail about a lot of these. I'll go into a little bit more detail about the ones I really want to talk about, which you'll see coming up why. But for the first story in here, we have Chimera House. Chimera House is a story where we have a group of friends in Detroit. In each of the stories in here too takes place in like a different culture, different setting and location, and some of them are kind of like loosely based on like old folk tales and legends, not quite as directly as like the stories from his Short and Shivery series, but some of these do have that same flair to it, where they take like elements of like old, legends and folk stories, that kind of thing, and kind of include them in these stories. So yeah, the very first story in here, Chimera, it takes place in Detroit. We have a group of friends. I believe they're teenagers. Even though this is aimed towards the more like middle grade audience, some of the characters in here are a little bit older, or in some cases even kind of on the younger side. In this case, I believe we have a group of teenagers who are told about this haunted attraction in Detroit that they want to visit, that is supposedly one of the scariest haunted attractions around. So they decide to go and visit this haunted house, to where you pay to go through it and experience, the different frights and scares with actors and animatronics and all that sort of thing. And this haunted house is rumored to have 4 different floors, I believe, or maybe it's 5, I can't remember for sure. And each like floor, like story of this haunted attraction is supposed to get scarier and scarier. And at first, as this group of friends go through this haunted house, it starts out like a very kind of basic haunted attraction. There's nothing really that terrifying about it. The characters kind of joke around and think it's like kind of lame and cheesy. But as they keep going through the floors, things get more intense. The scares are kicked up a notch. And then when they get to the final floor, there's kind of a startling discovery about what's on the final floor, because there's this rumor that no one has ever made it to the final floor. I think if they are able to like make it through the entirety of this haunted house, they get their money back. If I'm remembering correctly. However, one of the characters discovers something in this haunted house, kind of a real world horror. I guess it's kind of hard to discuss without spoiling it, but I'll say that we do get a little bit of backstory about this certain character and some things he was tied up with before he entered this haunted house, and those things may or may not kind of follow him into this haunted house and are kind of like the final encounter that he comes across, the final like situation that he has to go up against in this haunted house. So yeah, this very first story, Chimera House, I thought it was decent. It was okay. I gave it a flat 3 out of 5 stars. I enjoyed it for what it was. It didn't really impress me all that much. It was just mildly good. So yeah, that's Chimera House. The second story in here is called Webs. And in Webs, we have a family going on vacation to this big, like, I think like cabin or some kind of lodge up in the woods, out in the wilderness. And when they get to this lodge, the main character discovers that there's these spider webs all over the place, and he also encounters some spiders. And this is basically just a killer spider type story, I guess, like creature feature. Not every single story in this book is directly a haunted house type story. Most of them are. This one is probably the least haunted house, I guess, of the stories in here. However, I still enjoyed this one for what it was. This one is pretty straightforward. There's really not a lot going on with it. They pretty much encounter killer spiders. The main character kind of goes off in the woods, just like on a little expedition, and decides to go hiking. And he discovers this vehicle down at the bottom of this ravine, and there are like giant spider webs all around it. And he comes to the conclusion that there are giant venomous spiders roaming the countryside. And yeah, this one is basically about killer spiders. And I enjoyed this story as well. Again, nothing fantastic, and it's not exactly a haunted house story, but it was still fun. I enjoyed it for what it was. This one I also gave a flat 3 out of 5 stars to. Not really a lot to say about this story. So yeah, Webs was the second one in this book. And then the third story in here is called Dollhouse. This is where things get a little bit more interesting. I really like the concept of this one. So in Dollhouse, I believe we have a family, and then our main character, which is a young girl, like 12 or 13 or however old she is. And her parents tell her not to go in the basement because there's a lot of clutter down there and a lot of junk. And of course that makes her want to explore this creepy old basement of this new house that they live in. And she discovers this dollhouse, this very large and strange dollhouse with these, little miniature figures inside the house. And she finds this diary with these strange entries in this diary that tell the story of this girl that was killed, and her soul is basically trapped inside this dollhouse. And our main character puts her hand inside this dollhouse, and she feels like this strange sort of, I'm not sure even how to describe it, like presence, and she sees this light, and she discovers this soul of this lost girl like trapped in this dollhouse. And what happens is, I guess we're getting into kind of minor spoiler territory here. What happens is she cuts her hand or her finger, and the soul of this lost girl in this dollhouse or whatever, it somehow gets into like her bloodstream and starts to take over her body and possess our main character. Yes, there is possession in this book. I really dug this concept. This one to me felt a lot more unique, a lot more creative than the previous 2 stories. I was really enjoying the direction this one went. It was quite a bit darker. And overall, I did enjoy this one a little bit more than the previous 2. I gave it a 3.25 out of 5. However, I wasn't a fan of the ending of this one and kind of the resolution of the story. Our main character sort of discovers what's going on and the intentions of this soul of this dead girl, basically. And she figures out a way to resolve the issue. And the resolution, what she does to resolve this issue, this conflict, it didn't really work for me. It was kind of on the cheesy side. It was a little bit goofy, and I don't know. I would have preferred things to take a kind of a darker ending and not be so happy go lucky at the end. I don't know. I didn't really like the direction the story went by the end of it. I would have preferred it to end on a more ambiguous, kind of darker note. Because that's the direction it felt like the story was going. And then our main character is able to, you know, put a stop to the soul of this dead girl. And it just, I didn't really like how that played out. So yeah. But overall, this was still a decent one. 3.25 out of 5. I really enjoyed the concept of it. Very fun, very creative idea. Dollhouse gets a 3.25. Okay, the next story in here is called Tea House. And I mentioned the stories in here kind of have like different settings and cultures and things like that. And Tea House takes place in Japan and borrows from some old Japanese like ghost stories and folk tales and things like that. And it starts out like kind of a basic haunted house story. You have two young kids in Japan. Again, I'm not sure exactly on their age, but I believe they're around the age of like middle graders, probably 11 or 12 years of age. And they hear the story about this old abandoned haunted house known as this tea house. And they decide to go and explore just this house just for the heck of it, just just for the fun of it, to see if they can see this ghost. And sure enough, they do. And they get a little bit more than they bargained for. And this ghost comes after them. And this story was pretty frightening. I'm not going to lie. This story actually creeped me out a little bit. So this one doesn't really have that much of an intricate story or plot to it. It's kind of a basic haunted house ghost type story where they go to this haunted house and the ghost comes up and attacks them. However, the way it's written in the description of the ghost is absolutely terrifying. I'm going to get into minor spoilers, I guess, a little bit. It describes the ghost rising up from like the floorboards of this house. And this ghost woman has like long hair like covering her face. It reminded me of like the ghost from like The Grudge or the Ring movie. And the ghost is like crawling like all contorted across the floor towards the kids. And the kids run away or try to run away and escape this house. And they turn around at the last minute to see if they've lost the ghost or not as it's pursuing them. And they see a shadow moving across the ceiling. And they look up, and this ghost lady is on the ceiling, crawling on all fours with her long hair dangling down and like her long fingernails reaching for them. That absolutely scared the crap out of me. That was terrifying. And yeah, this story I gave a 3.5 out of 5 stars to. This story was straight nightmare fuel. I really enjoyed this one. I didn't really rate it higher because it was kind of on the basic side. It really didn't have much going for it other than just kind of the scares and this ghost lady coming after these kids. But it was a lot of fun, and I really enjoyed this one. So yeah, Tea House gets a 3.5 out of 5 stars. Okay, the next story in here is called Dust Creatures. And this one is quite a bit different from the other stories in here. This story is a little bit more on the lighthearted and humorous side of things. This one is really not scary, and it's basically kind of another basic haunted house setup. And you have these two kids that decide to, actually they don't decide to go in this haunted house. One of the kids actually like guilt trips, I think, her friend to go in it. She wants to explore it, the other one doesn't. And I believe they have like a pet dog, if I'm remembering right, that runs onto the property and they have to go chasing after it. And they decide to, or they go to look for her dog and then decide to go in the haunted house. I'm forgetting the fine details already, but something along those lines. And what happens from there is they discover that this old abandoned house is very dusty. There's lots of large dust bunnies everywhere. And they discover that these dust bunnies might not just be inanimate piles of dust. There may be some life to them. And yeah, this one is basically a killer dust bunny type story. There's different forms and shapes that this dust takes, and it basically attacks the children, our main characters in this tale. And this one was just kind of a fun, cheesy story. It wasn't all that great, if I'm being honest, but it was fun for what it was. It's a nice change of pace from the last couple of stories in here, which were a little bit more on the serious side, a little bit darker. So yeah, Dust Creatures I gave a flat 3 out of 5 stars to. Not really a lot to say about this one. It was just fun for what it was. So yeah. Okay, The next story in here is called Many. Now, this is one that I want to talk a little bit more about. So, Many is probably the darkest and scariest kids' short horror story I have ever read in my entire life. I am not exaggerating. So, Many is basically about this group of friends. There's quite a large cast of characters in this book. I think there's like 5 or 6 of these middle graders that are friends. And they're talking about this old abandoned, supposedly haunted house somewhere in this town that they live in. And one of these kids obtains a Ouija board. Yes, there is a Ouija boards in this book meant for children. And they think it'll be a fun idea to take this Ouija board to this haunted house and see if anything happens, see if they can contact, some spirits, some dead people, just as like a fun game to, scare each other and have a good time. They're really, don't mean anything by it. It's debatable whether or not they actually believe they'll be able to contact these spirits. They're just looking for some thrills, just some kids just looking to have a fun time is really all it is. Well, this group of friends, these 12-year-old kids, they go to this haunted house and they take the Ouija board up there and they start using the Ouija board. And when they try to talk to the spirits and contact the ghosts, the Ouija board spells out a message, and it's not the kids moving it around. Ouija board is actually working, and the spirits are actually contacting them. And what the Ouija board spells out, it goes to the letters M-A-N-Y to spell out many. Now, when the Ouija board spells this out, there was something that came to mind, a direction that I thought this story was going. And I'm like, no, that can't be it. There's no way this story is going to go in this direction. This is a children's book. It's not going to go there. It went there. So basically, again, kind of getting into minor spoiler territory here. I don't want to give this whole story away because this is one that I really enjoyed and was absolutely terrifying. And I highly recommend that you read this book for that story alone. But I got to tell you a little bit what happens to kind of give you an idea and kind of share my thoughts on this one a little bit more. So what the spirits are referring to when they say are many is they are referring to the many evil spirits, aka demons, that are inhabiting this house. The kids are just under the impression that they're there to just contact, dead people, the ghosts that have passed away in this house, if anything at all. And they get way in over their heads. They get way more than they bargained for. And the Ouija board continues to spell out this word over and over again. And from there, things take a turn for the worse. Some actual evil spirits are conjured up. And that's when things really start to go down. This story is absolutely terrifying. It actually freaked me out. This story scared the daylights out of me. What happens when these demons are conjured up in the presence of these children is just horrifying. The kids make a break for it. They try to escape this haunted house. Some bad things happen. They may or may not all escape unscathed. However, there is a very dark twist ending to this story that is just a massive gut punch. Now, I mentioned an earlier story in here called Dollhouse that had a really cool idea and was kind of dark, but it had kind of like too much of a happy ending for my tastes. Many rectifies that issue. This one has a very, very dark ending, and I won't say what it is to avoid spoilers, but this story was absolutely jaw-dropping. This story shocked me. I cannot believe that this isn't a children's book. You literally have kids in here playing with the Ouija board, conjuring up demons in this haunted house to where they very violently and maliciously attack these children. And I won't say what happens beyond that. This is one you need to read for yourself. I gave Many a 4 out of 5 star, or a 4.5 out of 5 stars actually. The only reason I kept it from being perfect, like 5 out of 5 stories, is because I felt like it was almost too much. I was a little bit uncomfortable reading this story. And I will admit, this is coming from the perspective of someone who does believe in evil spirits. I'm like somewhat of a religious, spiritual person. I guess you could say I do believe in God. I do believe in spirits to some degree. I don't think they are exactly as how they are often portrayed in fiction such as this. But I do believe in that sort of thing. And so reading this story and other stories in this kind of like subgenre of horror dealing with this subject matter, it makes me a little bit uncomfortable at times. And this story made me uncomfortable. I'm not going to lie. This this story was terrifying. So if you're someone that maybe isn't doesn't take that sort of topic as seriously, that doesn't believe in that sort of thing, you might not get the same kind of reaction from that story as I did. But that story was absolutely terrifying. I can't think of any other short story meant for this audience that is scarier. Many is like the darkest kid short horror story that I've ever read. I don't know what else to say about it. But I have to give it credit for being as effective as it was and for the author achieving his goal. It's funny, there's a tagline on the front of this book here at the top that says, "Are you scared yet?" And I remember as I think after I finished reading that story and I like flipped back to the cover and I saw that, I'm like, yes, I am terrified now. So yes, Many gets an almost perfect score. That story was phenomenal. Very, very dark and messed up for a kid's story. I don't even know if that story should be in this book, to be honest, but it is. And yeah, that was my favorite of this collection. And that was the 6th story in here, I believe. Okay, the next story in here is called The Lodge. And The Lodge is the only story in here that I didn't really care for as much. To me, this is the weakest one. I gave this one a 2.5 out of 5 stars. It still wasn't terrible. It wasn't bad. But this one is just kind of more of like a basic, like generic type ghost story, to where you had these kids, again, going on like kind of a vacation type thing. I think they're on a hunting trip with their parents, but they're not really hunting. The kids are just sort of staying in this giant lodge out in the wilderness while their parents are off doing hunting or whatever. And one of the kids discovers this ghost wandering the woods looking for her long lost child that was killed or something along those lines. I'm already forgetting the details, even though I just read it not long ago. Yeah, this one was just a little bit more dull than the others. It didn't really have anything going for it. It didn't really feel all that unique or special. And basically, the main character just has to help this ghost to be at peace, to find her lost children, and then the ghosts like cross over to the other side. It ends up being one of those like hallmarky, more like feel-good type ghost stories, and that's not really my speed. I'm not really into that type of thing, so yeah, that's why this one got a 2.5 out of 5 stars. Again, not terrible, but to me, that was the weakest story in here. So yeah, that's The Lodge. And then the next story in here is La Casa de las Muertas. I don't know Spanish. I'm sorry, guys. I do not know Spanish at all. I'll admit it. La Casa de la Muertos, I think. I believe in the story, the characters translate it as being the House of the Women. And this story was also pretty good. This one was pretty surprising. So in this story, we basically have a family who are driving on some kind of road trip, and they decide to take a stop, kind of visit their great-grandmother who passed away some time ago. I think they're going to like visit her house, which is kind of off in the desert, somewhere isolated. And while they're on their way to visit their dead grandmother's house, something pretty significant happens, something tragic. It's hard to talk about this story too much without giving anything away, but there's a pretty big event that takes place at like the halfway point of this story. And then from there, our main character is sort of lost and on his own. He was with his entire family. He had a sister. His parents were with them, driving them on this road trip. And then this sort of tragedy takes place, and he is kind of lost and on his own. And he tries to find this house of where his dead grandmother once lived. And he does find it. And when he gets there, it is not what he seems. It is not just this old abandoned rundown house, but he discovers 3 old creepy women living in this house that are very like, they just send off bad vibes. And he, I believe, claims or assumes that they are like witches of some sort. And this house is supposed to be abandoned. And yeah, these 3 old women are just chilling in this house, and they sort of like lure him inside. And then from there, they try to like tell him something. that may or may not have to do with the fate that he has come to and what has happened to his family members. Again, I'm kind of like remaining vague here because I don't want to give too much away. But yeah, I really enjoyed this story. It took a little bit of a different turn than I was expecting. This one kind of surprised me, but I really enjoyed this story. I gave this one a 4 out of 5 stars. This is one of my favorite stories in here. I think probably my third favorite of this collection. It wasn't really what I was expecting, and I wasn't a huge fan of like the final twist at the end, even though it was a bit predictable, and I kind of saw it coming. There was another like previous twist in the story that alluded to something else. I would have preferred it, I think, to go in that direction. We got something a little bit different at the very end. But overall, I enjoyed this one. This one was pretty good. I gave it like a soft 4 out of 5 stars. So yeah, there's that one. And then we have Dollhouse, which is the 9th story in this book. And this one was also very good. So in Dollhouse, we have our main characters, 2 brothers who are going to visit their uncle on like a vacation trip. And their uncle lives up in this, again, another like lodge cabin type story. And their uncle is like this writer, and he has this huge library and collection of like Weird Tales magazines. And there's a lot of references to like old classic literature and horror movies in here. Their uncle is a horror fanatic, which I think is really cool. I love the setup to this story. And this one, Dollhouse, is also the longest story in this collection at about 40 pages, I believe. And this one I feel is the most fleshed out of them all. It has the best characterization. I really enjoyed the setup to the story, the characters. I liked all the references to like real world literature and movies and everything. I found it to just be a little bit more immersive than the other ones. And while they're on vacation, the 2 brothers learn that their uncle's neighbor, who I think they also knew a little bit and were somewhat familiar with, died in a tragic murder, basically. I believe these guys broke into their uncle's neighbor's like house one day and like killed them and like stole a bunch of their stuff, and then also killed like their pet dog. Very messed up stuff. This is a children's book, mind you, but there are deaths and many references to death in this book. And the main character of this book, I believe his name is Blake. He has this sort of gift or ability, like psychic ability, ESP, to kind of like foresee the future and like see visions and things like that. He has these dreams. And while they're up at their uncle's lodge, he believes he discovers who is behind these murders. This is kind of an unsolved crime. Nobody was ever convicted of these murders that killed their uncle's neighbors. But Blake thinks he's on the trail of figuring this mystery out of who did this. And along the way, he encounters the characters that he is suspicious of. These criminals make some threats to Blake. This story has some pretty high stakes to it. There's also some very creepy dream sequences in here. Our character Blake, with those like ESP and psychic abilities, has some pretty dark and like scary visions throughout this story. And I really enjoyed those aspects of the story. They actually creep me out a little bit. And yeah, I won't say too much more and give this one away, but I really enjoyed Dollhouse as well. This one I also gave a good 4 out of 5 stars to. I think this one is probably my second favorite story in here behind Many. So yeah, I'd say Many is my top favorite story in here, and then Dollhouse, and then La Casa de, I can't pronounce it, as my third favorite. And then probably Tea House is my fourth favorite. And then we have one more story in here to talk about. The final story in here is called The Haunted Mansion. And this one was also good. I enjoyed this one. I think I gave this one like a 3.25 out of 5. This one is a little bit less serious and darker than the previous stories. This one, kind of like Dust Creatures, takes a more lighthearted, more comedy-based turn. It's not really quite as serious. And this one is basically about these kids who, again, kind of like a typical haunted house setup. I can't remember if they're on vacation, but there's these legends of this old house by this seashore. I believe this takes place on like a port somewhere or on the coast next to the ocean. And there's this legend of this old like pirate that was beheaded in this house and who hid a bunch of treasure in this house. But there's also this creepy like hermit guy, like hobo, living in this house. So these kids decide to go and explore this house and look for this lost treasure. And this basically turns into like a treasure hunting type story. And along the way, of course, they encounter this hermit, and they may or may not encounter the headless pirate ghost who is protecting his treasure. And yeah, this one, I don't really have a lot to say about this one. This was just kind of a fun adventure type story, not really that scary. This one leans more into like the humorous side of things, like I said. But I enjoyed this one. It was a little bit refreshing, a little bit different. And that's one thing too that I liked about this book as a whole, is it has a good variety to it. Not every story in here is just, you know, a basic haunted house story. You have a good variety of like humor and horror in here, with some of these stories being very dark and serious and scared me even as an adult. And then some of the other stories in here just being a bit more like on the lighthearted side. So yeah, The Haunted Mansion, I think I gave that one like a 3.25 out of 5. Overall, this was a really good book. This was quite a surprise. I did not expect to enjoy this as much as I did. Honestly, I think I might have enjoyed this more than the short and shivery books that I've read from this author, Robert Souci or Suchi. I'm not sure how to pronounce his last name. But yeah, even though those ones were really good too, I have enjoyed his other books, and I need to keep an eye out for his other books. I don't think he wrote a lot of horror books outside of this and the short and shivery series. I know he wrote a lot of like children's like picture books, like even for a younger audience than this. But I need to do a little bit more research and see what else he has out there, because I'm really curious now, and I'd like to collect more of this author's works, get the other 2 short and shivery books eventually. And yeah, overall, Haunted Houses, I would give this book probably a 3.5 out of 5 stars. I really enjoyed this. And if you're looking for something that's a middle grade horror book outside of the norm, outside of what you see most often, like Goosebumps, you know, some of the Goosebumps knockoffs, something just a little bit more obscure, I would highly recommend checking this one out. Not every story in here is a banger, but most of the stories in here I enjoyed to varying degrees, with one of them, many, being the darkest and scariest kid short horror story I've ever read in my life. So yeah, that is my review for Haunted Houses. And if you have read this book, let me know what your thoughts are down in the comments below. I would love to hear what you have to say about this one. And that's all I have for today. I'll see you guys next time.